what's interesting about this bill is that it was bipartisan. So the talking points among both Republicans and Democrats who favor it is that it removes some of the regulatory burden on your community banks, your smaller lenders. Where are they wrong? How are they misleading the public by stressing that?
So the biggest beneficiary, probably in net terms, are medium-sized banks, banks between $50 billion and $250 billion in assets. That's about 25 of the 38 largest banks, and together they control about a sixth of U.S. assets. They're huge beneficiaries, and they lose a lot of regulations that are very important for stability, such as enhanced capital requirements, living wills, and stress tests. There's also a lot of consumer deregulation in this, things that make it harder to enforce laws against subprime lending, anti-steering mechanisms, and so forth. There's also a couple loopholes in here that primarily we think will benefit the largest players in terms of how easy it is to write rules that go forward, and also domestic subsidiaries, U.S. subsidiaries of foreign banks. So there's a lot in here across the board that goes way beyond just trying to provide some relief for community bankers.
Mike, do you think in theory there could have been a good bill that would have provided relief to community bankers, but that didn't do all this other stuff that you regard to be as dangerous?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one way Dodd-Frank works is starting at $50 billion in assets, it starts a series of enhanced regulations that get bigger the bank is, at 250, 500, 1 trillion, and so forth. A lot of people think 50 billion is too low, and there's been talk for a couple years, including by people like Janet Yellen, to raise it to 75 or 125. This bill raises it to 250, which is incredibly aggressive given the scope of bipartisan talks that have been happening around that for a couple years. Community banks have gotten a lot of relief in the last couple years, and in general, they're far more profitable than I think people understand. Their presence is declining because of consolidation in the lower and medium-sized range, but absolutely, you could have given them some help without having to invoke all this other stuff.
Mike, there's been a lot of dismay on the left about the degree to which Democrats, whose votes have been needed to pass this bill, have supplied the votes. What's your theory for why they have been willing to do this, vote for this, which in your view is quite a gift to the industry?
Sure. So it's about a third of Democrats. I believe it's about 17 out of 48. So we're talking about a third. So none of the contenders who are rumored for 2020 in the Senate voted for it, which I think is very telling. Yeah. So it's not just the lefties, but people who are thinking a couple steps ahead are vocally against the bill, which I think is important. The senators who voted for this primarily are in states that voted for Trump. And they're facing re-election, so that's a big question mark for them. When we think of powerful banks, we think of like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, banks with trillions of dollars and a global footprint. But these regional banks are very powerful and often very popular in their local communities. And for statewide office, it actually does matter quite a bit if you can fundraise them. So I assume that is also part of the incentive package here.
Mike, as you say, the 2020 potentials did not support this. So that means that we could get further changes and re-regulation a few years down the road. What kind of effect does that have on an industry when you have this sort of whipsaw back and forth between regulation and deregulation in short spans of time?
Good question.
So, Dodd-Frank was an iterative process, involved a lot of rule writing. It actually was revisited several times through bipartisan legislation since 2010, but those were genuine technical fixes, clarifications, or pulling back on one or two things I think a lot of people agreed went too far. So, it has been a slow unfolding process. Some people think the process has been too slow and gradual. I would not expect a massive re-regulation package in 2021, though we don't know. We did know that Secretary Hillary Clinton had put forth a set of proposals that were much more on the enforcement side, moving past so-called deferred prosecution agreements when it came to wrongdoing in the corporate sector, maybe a slight enhancement in prudential regulations for so-called shadow banking, another kind of highly leveraged short-term lending products. So the next agenda will likely be a gradual increase or expansion of what is already happening in the regulatory community, though because this is such a serious deregulation bill, you may actually see, as you're hinting, a resurgence of calls for Glass-Steagall or breaking up the banks.